The radio answered with silence. On a live lane, silence can be a liar or a lifesaver. The specialist wearing the handset did not let the quiet dare him into speaking. He watched the field the way a person reads a face. Short grass leaned differently along the draw, and the dust over the spur road rose, hung, then settled with the patience of someone who had seen plenty. He had learned to count that sort of patience. His name was Nolan Pike, the new radio operator assigned to a platoon in a joint training problem where units from two commands practiced moving under the same sky without stepping on each other's work. On some days, the net was an orchestra. On other days, it was a roomful of people clearing their throats at once. Today, for a breath, it was a glass of water held perfectly still. He heard three sounds at once. A distant engine that kept second-guessing itself, an old flag that rattled like coins, and the kind of static that feels like the air is thinking. The platoon spread along a low spine of dirt. Before we begin, please subscribe for more videos and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from today. Heat made the distance wobble. Pike knelt behind a ragged bush and let the headset sit without pressing it closer. Pressing invites your own voice out. He had learned that too. A lieutenant named Avery Stone crouched 2 meters away. Stone had the calm posture of someone who rarely turned a problem into a speech. A staff sergeant, Harlan Brooks, kept the left flank from getting clever. None of them said a word. People think silence is empty. Silence is full of choices. The net cracked once, then twice. A call sign rolled out that was supposed to be theirs. It had the right syllables and the same steel in the pace. The voice was almost perfect, and almost is the kind of word that ruins a unit. Pike waited 1 beat. Waiting a beat is not about being timid. It is about letting the picture finish loading. He looked from the wavering grass to a ridge line that bit the sky and took a slow breath. He knew the clock did not own him. The clock lent him its frame. Stone's eyes moved to the side of Pike's face, but he didn't push. The platoon leader liked the silence when it had work to do. The voice repeated itself, inviting obedience. Pike used a short, ordinary challenge that sounded forgettable to anyone who didn't belong. No codenames. Nothing a movie could repeat with drama. Just a simple human question that a real friend could answer without lifting a notebook. The reply came back 2/3 right. 2/3 is almost perfect when you want to fail with style. Pike let a second pass. The draw below them lifted a little gust. The dust over the spur road moved to one side, like a curtain embarrassed by its own show. When the reply didn't finish well, Pike glanced at Stone and shook his head once. The smallest movement a man can make with his neck, while still meaning it. Brooks kept the flank still, because stillness has a job on certain days. Another voice now, clear and simple, claimed the same call sign a second time, and added a detail about terrain that nobody owns but the ground. Pike's own hand moved to the map board he had fixed to his thigh with elastic, not because he trusted the paper more than the dirt, but because the paper had an honest use in the right hands. He checked a sketch he had made that morning, just doodles of how the lines bent and where a water tower cut the horizon into north and not north. The second voice's detail matched the sketch without trying hard. 2 out of the 3 checks is not enough when the air is full of pressure. Pike waited for the third. He asked about a piece of junk nobody cared about, a broken windmill down the drainage. That detail should not matter to anyone except a real neighbor in the same field. The second voice named the color of its rust, and the way one blade always hangs a few degrees lower than the others. Some details are too small for a fake. The unknown first voice came back again anyway, with more confidence than caution, asking them to move. Pike let it pass through his ears, and die in a quiet place. He took a breath and talked to his own platoon for the first time in a while. Just the number of words a man can fit into a hand. The lieutenant nodded once. Brooks tipped a knuckle. The line did not move. Far on the right, a patch of brush twitched in the way brush twitches when someone is walking through it, while trying to be interesting about how he is not walking through it. The distant engine stopped, second-guessing. It sounded more sure of itself, which did not make Pike feel any better. Across the training area, another unit had been playing their own tune, a partner from a different headquarters using the same program but a different map language. One of their sergeants, someone Pike didn't know, had been told the world is UTM, and he believed it all morning until the ground asked him for degrees and minutes. The trouble with a shared field is that it looks like a single sentence until you realize two languages are being used to write the same line. A resupply truck, cheerful and on schedule, picked the wrong bend to favor. Pike did not know that truck existed yet, but he felt the background of the net get heavier, which is how a human body tells you something in your picture is tilting. The medic pushed a message onto the net, the kind that makes seasoned people go quiet and turn 1 degree more serious without widening their eyes. Pike looked at Stone. The lieutenant's mouth thinned, and a new silence entered the set. When a medword shows up, many people discover how much they love their own voices. Pike retightened the strap on the radio, not because it was loose, but because his hands needed something to do that wouldn't become noise. He answered with an acknowledgement clipped to respect. He did not promise anything the weather or the ground hadn't promised first. A new order flowed from a place that didn't quite belong. The kind of sentence that feels like leadership until you examine its passport. Pike asked for the smallest confirmation that Earth can grant. A direction a creek moves, a cut on a slope, the way the fence posts lean when you walk the line. The voice tried confidence again. Brooks, still hugging the left shoulder of the ridge, looked like a man listening to a story he had heard enough times to know that the ending is usually impatient and wrong. Pike shifted to an alternate frequency, long enough to ping a relay on their own side of the area. He kept it plain. They needed to verify that a pair of friendly elements drifting toward each other were indeed friendly, and indeed drifting. A corporal named Finley Rhodes, serving as an observer farther north, answered with a speed that said he had been holding his own breath. He described two sets of figures that had too much in common to be strangers, and not enough to be the same group. The slope between them hid more than it revealed. In the training area's rear, a captain from the operations shop, Layla Mercer, sat with a map that had too many colored lines and too much coffee. And she watched the paths on her chart cross like people crossing a hallway without looking up. The medical message grew a line longer. A concern about the spine. Pike could hear the pressure try to climb the tower in his chest. He asked a short series of questions to the medic on scene. He did not ask them like a test. He asked them like someone making sure the next sentence of the day would not pin a mistake to anyone's back. The medic, Tamsin Ward, sounded like a person who had already learned not to do showy bravery when care was the right answer. She had the patient still, airway clear, and a hand on the shoulder that rumored normal breathing into staying normal. A helicopter might come if the air and wind and distance made a decent window. If not, the ground would be their bridge. No hero words. Just the honest sentence everyone could sign. Pike returned to the primary net. The unknown voice wanted motion. It wanted credit for urgency. It wanted someone else to carry the blame later if the scene turned true and sharp. Pike gave it the sound of someone who is working. That sound can be mistaken for surrender. It is, in fact, the opposite. He put a quick rule in his own head: terrain check, human challenge, and a technical ping. Unless two of those leaned the same way, nobody moved more than a shoe's width. Stone did not interrupt to bless that rule. He owned that it was already the rule whether he spoke or not. Brooks stayed with the flank and let the bush rub his sleeve without adjusting. The way experienced people let a moment rub against them so the moment can agree to end without a fight. On the ridge's far side, the resupply truck finally pushed into sight where it never should have been. A driver who had been sure earlier now looked like a man whose certainty had put on a coat that didn't fit. The truck's antenna had snagged on a low branch and made a sound like a zipper dragged across old canvas. The radio inside their cab had been shouting into the wrong room. Pike did not look toward it. He let the observers carry the act of waving the truck into a better line. He kept the net short. Short beats elaborate when the air is crowded. He marked his board with a pencil dot he could later erase with the smear of his thumb. The map in Pike's lap had not lied. It had smiled. Smiling maps are not the same as true maps. He remembered an instructor once saying that paper is a rumor until the ground says yes. Across the net, somebody from the partner unit corrected a digit in their grid conversion, and in the same breath called their own people to hold at a fold in the land instead of pressing the line harder. Those two sentences, offered without applause, did more to save the afternoon than any long broadcast could have. Mercer, at the operations table, drew a small arc where two paths had nearly touched. It was such a thin arc you could miss it if you weren't in the habit of loving thin arcs. The wind traded angles. Flags pretended to have something new to say. The grass did less performing and more telling. Pike thought about speaking and didn't. The net's silence felt like a throat clearing on behalf of caution. Tamsin Ward came back up, steady as before, with a request no one had to admire to honor. Hold the patient still until the path to the collection point could be made honest. Pike passed the message on without adding the kind of flourishes that people add when they want to be remembered. Some jobs are better when nobody remembers who did them. Things that had been moving began to accept not moving, which might be the hardest part of any day. On the right flank, a private adjusted his helmet strap with a jerk that had too much nervousness in it. Brooks touched the back of the private's glove and let his hand rest there longer than the touch needed. That sort of time-worn gesture is a sentence people write with skin, so they don't have to write it with sound. Stone wrote his own sentence by rereading what was in front of them without asking for a new chapter. Pike wiped his board once where the pencil had started to overstay its welcome. The first fake voice died away the way uninvited things die when nobody feeds them. The second right voice said less and meant more. A report from the north confirmed that the two friendly elements had paused in lines that would no longer collide if nobody went looking for a reason to be dramatic. Pike rolled the handset against his palm and let the plastic warm. He breathed the way he had practiced, a little longer on the way out than on the way in, because patience is not just a character trait. It is a body habit you can build the way you build any other habit, one small repetition after another until waiting feels like a skill instead of a punishment. A short rain stepped across the far edge of the area and darkened the soil just enough to make the ridgelines bolder. When rain presses a drawing into relief, it is easier to believe what the map tried to say. Mercer checked with range control about airspace, just in case the helicopter favorite turned into a real visit. The answer came back that the window could open if everyone else agreed to stop thinking of air like a free hallway. People who spend their days inside offices forget how often the sky has more to negotiate than a road. Someone with a good memory for these things scheduled 5 minutes for the air only and promised to keep them honest. The stretcher team worked their way around a line of vehicles and a cluster of good intentions. Tamsin Ward kept her voice even when she brushed away hands that wanted to help in ways that would have made help a rumor of a help. She kept the patient breathing and counted the breaths by listening to her own instead of a watch. Pike did not translate her steadiness into hero words on the net. He passed exactly what she wanted him to pass. The rest of it stayed inside the scene where it belonged. There are phrases people use in after-action reports about this sort of thing. Appropriate restraint is a favorite. What it looks like in real life is the simple refusal to get loud when loudness tries to dress up like urgency. A generator far to the rear coughed into life, and then quieted, as if embarrassed by its own attempt at a solo. A bird cut a slow line above the berms. A trainee on another lane, in a story that belonged to somebody else, fired a blank that popped like a bubble you might pop, to mark a joke that is getting too pleased with itself. For a moment, Pike felt everything sharpen. An old trick of the brain when it wants to remember a setting so it can bring you back to it correctly later. He wondered if he would remember the feel of the radio's knurled dial against his thumb. He wondered if he would remember the exact angle of the broken windmill blade. He wondered how long it would take before he forgot these details on purpose so he could stay useful to the next day, instead of trying to live in this one forever. The alternate frequency carried a short confirmation. The path to the collection point had been walked and was now clean. No one had pushed a truck through to win points. No one had rushed a stretcher just to claim speed. Stone looked at Pike, and then at the ground, and then at Pike again. Brooks exhaled through his nose in a way that only people who had been holding uncomfortable stillness can exhale. Pike keyed the net exactly long enough to pass a sentence with 3 nouns and a verb. Motion would be plain and slow. Nobody needed to own it. The job would own it. He did not like the word leadership when people made it sound like a hat you put on. He liked it better when it felt like something that grows from quiet choices until it has weight in it. Today's weight did not belong to him. It belonged to a rule obeyed, and a handful of breaths taken on purpose, and a map corrected without fuss, and a broken windmill that told the truth to someone who knew to ask small questions. He thought about returning the handset to its cradle more firmly than necessary. Instead, he set it down as if it might be sleeping. Stone moved his knee, and pins and needles woke it up. Brooks shifted to let a rock stop pretending to be a pillow. Somewhere behind them, a sergeant from the partner unit walked up to his own radio operator and said something very short that meant thank you without saying the word, or inviting anybody to feel obliged to say you're welcome. That is the kind of conversation that does the real work of a joint problem. On the far side of the ridge, Finley Rhodes drew a messy circle on his notebook and drew a line through it, then smudged it with his thumb until it looked less like a circle and more like something the mind had decided to let go. He would throw the page out later, which is sometimes how you file a lesson in the right drawer. Mercer stacked the colored markers and left the map with its too many lines alone. Leaving a thing alone can be a creative act if you let it. The helicopter window opened and closed without a show. The air made room. Tamsin Ward handed the patient to a team that spoke their craft with the same quiet Pike had tried to keep in the net. The rotors did what rotors do. The grass flattened in a radius and then forgot what had happened, the way grass always does. Pike watched until watching stopped being a job and started being a habit, then looked at Stone. The lieutenant nodded toward the low spine of dirt where they had begun the day. It was time to move back through the ground they had already named and check that none of their sentences had left a word behind. On the way, they passed the broken windmill. It was exactly the color it had been reported to be. The low blade hung exactly as advertised. Brooks tapped the metal with the back of his knuckle and made a sound like a coin dropped in a jar that isn't yours. Pike smiled at the thing, because it is good to be grateful to the props when a day depends on props that didn't ask to be important. They reached the far end of their lane. People who had been trying hard all morning began to look like themselves again, as if the world had remembered who they were. The debrief did not happen under a spotlight. It happened in the shade of a truck with a table that wasn't level, on paper that took pencil and sweat with equal hospitality. Mercer brought over a clipboard and a simple sketch. Stone didn't sit. Brooks leaned on a bumper facing out, the way men lean when they want to stay available to movement. Pike stood where he could hear without being the center of the circle. They didn't use formal phrases like key takeaways. They named scenes the way you name streets on a map, so the next driver can make the turn without a fuss. They wrote 3 short lines and agreed to live inside them. See the ground where the decision lives, not just the lines on the paper. Make the safety signal visible and let it run the schedule instead of pretending schedules are sacred. Confirm the human fact before you trust the technical report. Each line sounded like something a person's grandmother could have said about a different kind of day. That is the point. Good lines work in many rooms. Pike added a 4th in pencil, where only he would see it. Leave space. He promised himself not to say it out loud to anyone else because the line would get worse if it had to survive a speech. They talked about the 2 voices that had claimed the same call sign. They did not make a legend out of it. The first voice had played confidence with the precision of someone who had practiced, and the second had spoken like a person who did not mind being believed a little too slowly. They wrote down the small challenge Pike had used and promised to vary it carefully. They resisted the urge to build a fortress of rules around a problem that sometimes only needs 2 well-placed bricks. They noted how the medic had kept the patient still, and how the stillness had made more motion possible later, not less. They left the part about the windmill on the page where they had written it, and agreed that a scrap of junk can teach if you let it. They reviewed the near miss, the drift that had almost become a crossing. Nobody took a victory lap. That would have made the lesson smaller. Pietas, the old word for respectful duty, does not thrive around victory laps. They drew the paths as they would like to see them next time, not as a punishment, but as a promise. Pike traced a thin arrow with his pencil and erased half of it, so the arrow looked like a suggestion instead of a command. He liked it better that way. Stone put a dot on a spot where a vehicle should pause before it becomes inconvenient, then drew a second dot where it could wait without becoming scenery. Brooks circled a tiny slope and wrote "temptation" next to it. Everyone knew what he meant without asking. A private asked if the silence had been the plan. Stone said no. Plans are bolder than silence. The quiet had been a choice the plan allowed. Pike liked the answer. He had learned to distrust neat answers that make plans sound like heroes. He preferred messy answers that gave credit to a rule that could survive next Thursday. They closed the clipboard without signing it. Some documents work better when they feel anonymous because then they belong to whoever needs them next. As the shade moved, the field shifted back from story to place. The draw went back to being a draw. The wind went back to the unremarkable business of going wherever it felt like. The broken windmill could go back to being broken instead of being instructional. Pike adjusted the strap on the radio and looked at his own hands. They were just hands. The sort of hands that, if lucky, would be holding something useful again tomorrow, and if luck had its way, might be allowed to do so without applause. Stone checked the distant skyline like a man checking a friend's expression across a crowded room. Brooks kicked a buried root with a toe, and then stopped so his boot could forgive the root for being where roots are. They stepped off. The net became a room that people entered only when they had to. The road was not really a road. It was the idea of a road that trucks had decided to honor. They followed it back to a place where someone had strapped a tarp to poles to pretend the sun was a friend. The sun ignored the pretense and worked on anyway. Someone handed out water that tasted faintly of rubber and hose, and nobody complained. Complaints take more energy than thirsty men are willing to spend on the truth. Pike let the water touch the back of his throat and paid it the attention water deserves. He let it remind him that the body is not a concept. Later that day, later enough that the adrenaline had climbed down, but not so late that people had begun to rewrite the day in their heads, a master sergeant from the training cell visited to listen more than to speak. He had the kind of gaze that likes details without needing to own them. He asked 3 questions, each of which was a short hallway leading to a room where someone else's answer could sit. He did not chase his own reflections in the window of the conversation. He wrote down very little and then read it back. It sounded like the afternoon. That is all anyone can ask of a debrief, that it sound like the afternoon you lived instead of the movie you want to tell later. He kept the praise small. He kept the corrections practical. He praised the awkward grace of waiting inside rules and corrected the habit of making sentences longer than the scene could carry. He asked Pike what he would change about the way he handled the first, almost perfect voice. Pike said he would have done the same thing but with 2 fewer syllables. The master sergeant smiled with half his face, which is as far as true smiles go in a place like this. He told Brooks that the hand on the glove had been the right length and told Stone that nodding when you already agree means more than re-explaining what you agree about. He told everyone else to take their gifts and the day's lessons and go eat before the sun decided to pick a fight again. As dusk wrote softer lines between things, Pike walked past the broken windmill one more time. Because teaching yourself to say thank you to inanimate objects is a small discipline that can keep a man from thinking his job is to be dramatic. He listened to the blades creak and did not assign the sound a moral. He did not imagine it would become a symbol people would carve into wood somewhere. He let it stay a creak. He let the day stay a day. The radio on his shoulder, for once, felt like it weighed less than the strap that held it. He liked that feeling. He suspected he would not be allowed to keep it, and he was not offended by that suspicion. Pike thought about the first time he had been trusted to hold the net, and how much of that day had felt like trying to keep a glass full without spilling a drop while walking through a room that wanted him to bump into tables. He thought about how the glass had gotten steadier without getting smaller. He thought about the fact that the best advice he had ever been given about the handset had come from a mechanic who said the trick to avoiding stripped threads is to start the turn by going the wrong way first and listening for the click that tells you thread has found thread. He realized there was a radio version of that. Start by asking the world to confirm itself. And if you don't hear the click, stop forcing the handle. He smiled because metaphors are often the only way a human brain can turn a pile of moments into something it can remember without dropping pieces. Over the next few days, the story refused to grow decorations. It did not pick up heroes. It developed only a habit of being told with the same small words by all the people who were there. A rumor tried to grow that Pike had saved the day. The rumor died when Stone refused to feed it, and Brooks starved it by declining to tell it to anyone who wanted to be impressed. Mercer wrote a short paragraph for the training note that did not include a single adjective and read like directions to a familiar grocery store. The paragraph said that the net had been kept clean, that a map had been corrected, that a patient had been held still until motion made sense, and that 2 voices had been asked the kind of questions that small truths can answer. The paragraph did not say who had asked them. Good paragraphs are generous like that. The range workers, who love the field the way librarians love shelves, stapled a paper near the shack where people sign out radios. The paper didn't have a title. It had 3 lines, the same ones they had written in the shade. See the ground where the decision lives. Let the safety signal own the schedule. Confirm the human fact. A 4th line, smaller, had been added in pencil by someone whose handwriting was neat enough not to call attention to itself. Leave space. The pencil line smudged over the week and had to be retraced. People retraced it without signing their names. The line survived anyway. A week later, a visiting officer asked Stone to present the incident to a room that loved bullet points. Stone politely suggested the officer visit the field instead and watch how a day behaves. He said lessons travel better when they walk. The officer seemed surprised, but said yes. He arrived 2 days later to find the lane quiet, the radios quiet, and the people doing the world's least cinematic work with deliberate care. He watched Brooks touch a glove, Tamsin Ward keep a patient's breath honest, and Pike let a silence finish what it was doing. He watched Stone decline to narrate the scene, and decided there was nothing to present. There was only something to respect. A month passed. Pike took leave to visit a river that had no range on it. He watched the water do what water does, and felt the way a man feels when he wants the world not to need him for a few days. He left his phone on a table and did not feel naked. He returned to find the same net waiting for him, with a new set of announced problems and a new set of unannounced ones. He took the handset with the sort of gratitude a person gets when he has been allowed to be useful once and is being asked to be useful again. He promised himself, not as a vow but as a habit, that he would let the picture load before he touched it, that he would ask small, true questions before he offered hard answers, and that he would walk away from the day without needing to know whether he had been a hero. He would know whether the silence had done its job. That would be enough. On a morning when the sky sat heavy, but the air stayed cool, a new radio operator shadowed Pike for a few hours. The young man kept adjusting his earpiece like it was a hat he couldn't decide how to wear. Pike didn't offer him mantras. He gave him one small exercise. Pick one thing you can see that the map can't, he said. Not whispering, not teaching, just sharing a small piece of work. The kid chose a leaning fence post. Later that day, when a voice claimed to be a friend and asked for motion, the kid asked about the fence. The voice guessed and guessed wrong. Motion did not happen. Pike didn't clap. He didn't nod. He let the kid feel how it is to build a day out of small checks that nobody applauds. By then, the broken windmill had been fixed by a crew that had no idea they had robbed a story of its favorite detail. The blade no longer hung wrong. The rust no longer matched a sentence on a clipboard. Pike laughed when he saw it and liked the joke. The world rarely holds a prop in place for you. It asks you to find new ones. He pointed out to the kid that the windmill's lesson had never been the object itself. It had been the practice of asking about an object nobody would choose as a stage prop. It had been the modesty of details. The kid nodded like a person nods when he hears something he might remember. And if he didn't, the world would give him a second chance in some other field with some other piece of junk. And so the day that had begun with a silence continued to write itself as a sequence of ordinary choices made with the care that ordinary choices deserve. The radio answered with silence again, and again the silence decided to be useful. The lane swallowed and released footsteps, and never once wondered if it was famous. The map smiled, and then told the truth the second time without being offended. The patient breathed. The truck returned to the road that is not quite a road. The helicopter performed its own job without asking for clapping. The bird drew a line and forgot it. The wind changed its mind and owed no one an explanation. Nolan Pike put his hand on the handset, held it as if it were a brother's shoulder, and let the world tell him when to speak. He waited, and then he spoke, and then he waited again. In a profession that loves noise, he chose the quieter craft. It might be the only one that lasts. The week after, the company ran a comms rehearsal with nothing moving but words. They called it a map drill, but it behaved like a patience drill. Different sections took turns being the friction. The maintenance bay pretended to lose power, and the net pretended not to. A signal sergeant, glasses smudged with the day, traced coax lines with a finger and taught younger hands to respect connectors like they respect fingers. One cross-threaded collar, and your perfect plan is now a story about a plan. Pike stood near the board and listened to voices find the habit of saying less. Real fixes followed. A spare whip antenna mounted where a truck would not eat it, a label replaced so it would not peel. A patch lead rerouted along a place hands don't grab when they are tired. At dusk, they ran the same drill outside and let distance make sentences fray. A rumble strip at the range road chewed transmissions and spat them out crooked. The temptation was to talk louder. The cure was to speak cleaner. Stone popularized a small phrase. Say the picture, not your feelings about the picture. Brooks added his own. If you are guessing, say you are guessing. Then stop guessing. Tamsin Ward attended even though nobody asked her to. She asked the operators to build a simple med handoff template that fit on a business card. They wrote it in pencil and laminated it wrong on purpose once, so they would remember to get it right later. On a gray morning, fog rolled into the low parts of the training area and put a lid on visibility. The lane looked like a line drawn under wax paper. The fog taught everyone the difference between not seeing and not knowing. You can know a lot in a fog if you respect the parts of the world that keep talking. Fence lines still tell the truth under fog. Ditches still keep their promises. Birds still choose shelter. Pike slowed his breathing and let the fog make him honest. He asked short questions that the fog could answer. The net caught the rhythm and stopped asking it to do a sunny day's work. An instructor from another post visited and asked to watch the platoon run a low-mobility scenario. The instructor was the kind who notices how long a man looks at a thing before he decides instead of how loud he speaks when he decides. He said little and wrote less. Afterward, he told Stone that he heard 3 moments when someone could have rescued their own pride with a fast sentence, and instead did the ugly work of saying nothing. He called that maturity. He left before anyone could make that word into a trophy. When the real field problem kicked off again, radios took their seats like old men at a bar who have already told each other all the stories they care to tell. The joint partner returned with their maps corrected, and their pride dipped just low enough to let a lesson land. Pike found it easier to like them now. He had nothing against confidence that survived a correction. He kept his ear tuned for the sound of an almost perfect voice. It did not arrive. What arrived instead were the usual pelts a field day wears, wind that changes its name mid-sentence, trucks that forget what lane discipline is, and people who believe a sigh equals a plan. He treated them all the way he had decided to treat difficulty, like furniture that belongs in the room and needs dusting, not like a monster. If this had been your net, what would you have asked first? Midway through that block, they staged a CASEVAC by ground when airspace went into timeout. Tamsin Ward coached 2 soldiers new to the straps. She made them rehearse in slow motion first, then at normal speed, then in slow motion again. He folded the map and let the day stand on its own feet. The habit of leaving space had done its quiet work. The lane held steady, the people remembered what mattered, and the radio waited like a tool that never asks to be the story. He shouldered the set and walked back into the light.